Welcome to Transcendent Psych. Today I'm considering Bernardo Kastrup, idealism and free will. Towards the end of the video, I'm going to show a clip of Bernardo once we've kind of laid out some of the framework, and then we'll have a little bit of a think about what he has to say himself. So my first question is, I've actually made a mug. This is handmade, so I do apologise, but a mug for the Transcendent Psych channel. This was kind of like a work away day thing. I kind of quite like it, but you know, who knows, when we get to reasonable size, you guys share these videos on, might be able to do some proper merch down the line, so we'll see. My question though is, did I choose to make my mug and the way it is like this, or was it a product of random chance or necessity, the laws of physics, kind of atoms and molecules kind of shaping my entire decision? Or did I have some element of freedom of choice in that matter? So we're asking the classic debate question around free will, which kind of often gets quite boring and kind of whatever, and people gone around the houses on this for centuries, both in kind of secular and theological circles. Anyhow, what I'm going to basically do is set out some of the main ideas in the free will debate very briefly. Some of you might be familiar with this already, and then we're going to consider it from an idealist point of view, and particularly Bernardo Kastrup's view. Does being an idealist necessitate being a determinist of some kind and not having free will? Okay, now for those of you not familiar with Bernardo Kastrup, idealism is basically the view that all of reality is ultimately mental. It's an occurrence within consciousness. It's a very different view to that of materialism that basically says, well, your consciousness, as you're watching this video, either it's some kind of illusion, kind of Dan Dennett's view, philosopher of mind, or it's, just a kind of epiphenomenal froth, a byproduct, if you like, of just physical stuff. Okay. Anyway, I share Bernardo Kastrup's view. I am an idealist of sorts. So let's get down to the issues with free will. So the classic debate kind of gives you three rough options in terms of where you land on the question of whether you really have free will, whether I really actually had a choice about making this mug and designing it the way I did, or whether it was just always going to happen that way. So you've got determinism is one option. You've got libertarian free will is another option, very popular in some circles. And another view, kind of in the middle, I should do like determinism, it's just going to get rude, determinism, free will, and then kind of compatibilism, which is kind of like a halfway house in the middle of sorts, although it's really basically determinism, but we'll get to that in a minute. So determinism basically means, here's my kind of back of a postcard definition. So it's the idea that a behavior or an entity is controlled in its capacity to choose by its own law-like nature, or usually what often happens under materialism, a lot of modern thinking, is that it means it's determined by its physical composite parts, and therefore there's no real freedom, that the consciousness that's produced by those material parts, if you like, likewise has no freedom. But you can have determinism, as Bernardo Kastrup has in some sense, under an idealist way of looking at the world. Okay, we'll come back to that in a minute. And then there's libertarian free will, which is the belief that under the exact same conditions, both internally, your state of mind, and externally in the environment, that you could have chosen differently. Faced with exactly the same variables, you could make a different choice. Then there's compatibilism, and that's the idea that we are free, but only free to will what is determined in our determined natures within a determined cosmos, if you like. So free here is a little bit slippery. Free under the idea of compatibilism basically means that you're at liberty to act as you choose, but your choosing really only has one path. So it's kind of like determinism really, but it's just saying, yeah, but you're free to be what you're determined to be. Okay, what you're set up as. Okay. And depending on what you mean, I have problems with each of these different views, and I favour the idea of there being freedom of what I'm going to call the rational will. But again, we'll come back to this. We'll need to be careful how we define freedom. So these debates normally occur between materialists, those that think, as I said earlier, the mind is, just the products of atoms and molecules and physics, and those that believe in a kind of soul of some kind, an ethereal aspect of the human being. But when we come to Bernardo Kastrup, here we have a naturalist, someone who believes only in this kind of nature working out in its mechanisms, doing what it does. But he's also an idealist, and he believes in some version of determinism. So he doesn't believe there's any material kind of atoms and physics kind of forcing you to make the choices that you do. He's not a determinist in that sense, but he does believe that that all of nature is kind of just mental processes and you're part of that, and that this operates in a kind of mechanical, mechanistic way. So what should we make of that? So I don't think there's anything per se terribly incoherent about his view. It is possible that there's just a kind of law-like cosmos that's mental in nature, or these mental processes generating and evolving other kind of law-like mental natural processes like you and me. And, I think, as I said, BK is a compatibilist of some sorts. He thinks he is free to do what he wants to do, but I think I've heard him quote Schopenhauer in saying that, kind of I'm free to will what I want, but I don't get to choose my wants, to butcher Schopenhauer slightly there. So the question really is, well, is there another option, even under especially under an idealist way of looking at the world, where we're not forced into materialist conceptions of reality? Is there another option for considering the will? So I'm going to start by just running through some of the objections that I have to some of the positions that we outlined earlier, the typical positions people take in these free will debates. So libertarian free will first. The problem I have with libertarian free will people is that they don't really factor in this element that we have a nature, that we come in a sense pre-packaged with dispositions towards certain ends. And then, of course, if you want total freedom in the way they think of it, that libertarian sense, you then end up with chaos and a kind of randomness where, I could end up willing anything, whether it's good or bad for myself, just as the dice happens to land. And that, I would suggest, is not freedom. I don't think any of us would choose to live in that kind of world with that kind of Russian roulette version of the will. So what about determinism? Determinism, well, it could be that we live in an entirely naturalistic cosmos that simply plays itself out as the product of its mechanisms, a kind of mental machinery, if we're going to think of it as an idealist determinism. But I don't share this view, although not because I don't think there's directionality to the mind or the cosmos, but because I don't think our experience of consciousness quite fits that picture, even if we experience ourselves to quite some extent as pushed and pulled by natural mechanisms. So I'm not denying those exist at all. I'm a therapist into psychology. I'm fully aware of all the sorts of ways in which our minds get primed by all sorts of things at a conscious and unconscious level. So what about compatibilism? Again, considering it in an idealist framework. Well, I think it runs into exactly the same problems. It's still accounting for the activity of consciousness on a mechanistic basis, as though you are nothing but a puppet pulled by strings kind of lower down in the cognitive pecking order, if you like, beyond your own agency. There's kind of mental processes out there that just pull your strings. And that, I think, is Bernardo Kastrup's view, as we'll hear him towards the end. So that view, that kind of idealist, compatibilist view would say, again, yeah, you're free in the sense of you can do what you want, but you don't get to choose what your wants are. You have agency in a sense, but that agency is already stuck in a rut that it's going to run. And I've heard Bernardo Kastrup talk in that way, saying kind of things like, you know what, this is what nature, this is what mind at large, this is what consciousness is running through me at the moment. I'm letting that kind of run its course. Don't fight nature. Although to the extent that you've already got capacities given by nature, he would argue you should try and kind of temper it because you have capacities endowed to you by nature. Interesting. Well, I kind of smirked there, but yeah, fair enough. There's another view. So this is where I go. Another view that I think is articulated well by the philosopher David Bentley Hart, who, I should add, is publishing a long-awaited book this year on consciousness. This view is that you and I are rational souls, a form of rational consciousness. Now, there's more to us than just that. I mean, we have the unconscious and so forth as well, but we are nevertheless rational souls. We are rational consciousness. And as such, you are not run simply by mechanisms, be they atomic or mental levers, but you rather are an intellect, a consciousness that participates in, I want to underline that word, participates in, and is drawn towards a higher transcendent reality by virtue of your capacity to see what Hart calls the horizon of the good. Now, this is a Platonic view. Consciousness, as well as its intellect, is something we participate in. And this, of course, draws on also on the Aristotelian idea that causation is simply not simply a matter of being pushed and pulled from behind, like what Aristotle called the efficient cause, the kind of mechanisms, your cause and effect, that there are other causes for Aristotle, but that an entity like you or I can also be for something, that we are given towards something, a why. The lamps in my room, for example, have a mechanical explanation, but that doesn't cover all the bases or a full explanation, as to what they are. They're also there to illuminate my room. And without that reason or cause, they would not be here. And so, and it could be the same with us. Our intellects, argues Hart, and indeed the entire cosmos, is kind of for and towards the horizon of the good. We are existing for a purpose. We are here within a greater transcendent reality in which we participate. So this is an idea, in a sense, that's kind of top down. It's not necessarily everything's produced from the bottom up causally, like atoms up to bodies to, physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, consciousness, that actually what we see at the lower levels of reality is a participation and an unfolding out of higher levels of reality, greater reality that already exists. So this view has this idea of directionality or orientation, an unfolding, albeit still with mechanisms that exist, we don't need to deny at all, but all unfolding towards a goal, a telos. So it's a teleological view of reality and a teleological view of consciousness. So we've got lots of highfalutin words there. Let's come back to a clear human example. So if you chose to watch this video up to this point, well done. Thank you. Do consider subscribing and putting a like in there while you're at it. But But was there not a kind of deliberative sort of choice in your doing so? Maybe you wanted to find out some more truth. Maybe you simply wanted to debunk my arguments. Maybe you wanted to while away the time with my mellifluous British accent in the background. Most viewers to this channel, by the way, are from the US. So, while you ironed your shirt for work. I don't know. But I do know that you chose to do so because you had a reason. I'm assuming here, of course, it's not just gone on play from the previous video, but if you chose to do so, you did so for a reason. There's a rational choosing going on there. And I would suggest that all of our conscious decisions are there. And there are plenty that we delegate to unconsciousness, but all our conscious decisions are the result of some desire towards the good in some form, some good. And I've done other videos that talk about all our desires in a sense point towards an ongoing search for the good, but that's another subject. Okay, you say, but if all our desires are orientated towards goods, like you chose to watch this video because there was a good that you were after, isn't that a return back to determinism again? That you did it because in true Schopenhauerian fashion, there were desires in you already that were unbidden and unchosen. And in a sense, I agree. But that doesn't make the determinations, if we want to call them that, something mechanical. Kastrup's view, and I hope I'm doing him justice here, would be that there are kind of autonomous mental mechanisms that dictate what you want. So you're part of the whole of nature, but there are kind of separately operating, I say separate, they're not actually ontologically or kind of in their being separate from you, you're part of it, but they work independently to some extent in their operations upon you, in his view. And they dictate what you want. The determination, in my view, rather, is that you and I are unified, rational, conscious, willing agents. You are a will, admittedly, surrounded by unconscious influences and biological mechanisms, but nevertheless a unified, conscious, rational agent that can and does make conscious choices based on reasons. What is that? Does that then take us back to kind of libertarian free will? And I'm going to say no. You can't just do anything random or just do anything at all. Nor could you want to just do anything at all. That would be back to the problem of chaotic randomness. Rather, you, when you are possessed of your right mind, as a rational soul, you will make rationally intelligent choices in consciousness, but you are choosing them. I'm going to give you an illustration because this point sometimes is easy to lose with people. I remember having this sort of discussion with a friend years ago. So I live in England. I'm not far from the New Forest. So imagine I'm driving my car through a nice smooth road in the New Forest. There's not that many of those, by the way, because a lot of them have these cattle grids to stop the wildlife escaping. But anyway, so I'm driving along my road, and I'm kind of aware that I could, if I wanted to, the thought crosses my mind, I could just yank the wheel to the left or the right and go careering off into the kind of rough ground. Okay, I might put my life at risk, and I'm likely to do some serious damage to my car. All right. Why will I not do that? Because I'm in my sane right mind, and the rational thing to do is to choose what is good. I want a car that functions. I don't want to get injured. I'm choosing the good. So, but was that is that determined in some fashion by mechanisms? I would say it's determined when that thought pops into my mind by my rational choosing. So I am choosing to do it. It's not determined in the sense that I could not do otherwise. I could, if I wanted to, yank the wheel and cause chaos. Okay, but I'm not going to, not because there are mechanisms forcing me not to, but because I am making a rational choice based on the goods that I desire, the telos, that orientation towards the goods that I desire. That is what prevents me from making that choice that I could, in theory, make. Now notice that is different from a causal mechanism. Okay, that is there's rationality, there's reason behind that. Now, actually, I mean, to some extent, you might say that's not the best example because there might be kind of things going on in my amygdala going, yeah, that's that causes fear. Don't do that. I don't know. Let's pick another example. Let's say I go for I'm thinking about going for a nice hike up into the mountains, a nice trail trek for the afternoon. Am I forced into that by mechanisms, or is there kind of free choosing based on goods that I can rationally see taking me towards those goods? Yeah, I would say so. So I would say we don't have to have an idealist view that is purely mechanistically deterministic in the way that perhaps Kastrup argues, if I'm being fair to him. But we could have a kind of idealist view that is compatible, what we might call rational free will, which is not libertarian free will, and it's not mechanistic determinism, and it's not compatibilism, although it's similar to compatibilism, except the kind of the factor at play here. There's still actual real choice. I could do otherwise, but I'm drawn by this telos, by this rationality. The intellect participates in the great, in Platonic thinking, that our consciousness participates in the greater rationality and nous, as the Greeks called it, in intellect. I'll stop there. But okay, so I'm going to show the clip by Bernardo next, and then we're just going to make a few comments about that as we close. So
I think extensive personal free will requires a person to truly exist as an entity, and it is not an entity separate from its environment. So personal free will is a very precarious concept to begin with. Where is that this distinct entity that we are talking about? It's like saying that the whirlpool has free will. Well, the whirlpool is just a name that we give to a particular behavior of the river. It's not a thing. So it cannot have free will because it's not there to begin with. It's an identifiable pattern of behavior that you can delineate, but it's not a separate entity with an agency of its own. In the same way, I think people are like whirlpools. There is nothing to people but nature. People are doings of nature. People are something nature is doing, not an agent separate from nature that can in turn define its own actions, because that agent is itself a doing. So how can it be free to do beyond the thing that does it?
Exactly.
It can't. But I
Exactly.
think the red herring of free will go even beyond that. Even if we you know get rid of this illusion of separateness, and we understand that people are not separate entities but doings of nature, actions of nature, and we say, okay, the only thing that truly exists is nature as a whole, even then to speak of free will is it creates a semantic distinction that has no correspondence in reality. Specifically, when we say that we choose out of our will, what we're trying to do is to contrast that with choosing out of necessity. So if there is a necessity for me to choose as I do, then I'm not free to choose. I'm only free to choose if I can choose in spite of and contrary to whatever necessities obtain, whatever necessities are the case in nature. But if the entity we are talking about is nature as a whole and there is nothing outside of it, then whatever it chooses is determined by what it is. And then the difference between will and necessity completely disappears. What nature must do is what it necessitates to do, because it is what it is and not something else.
Okay, so Bernardo makes 3 claims here. 1, for Bernardo, he says, basically, for an entity to have free will, it would have to be an entity, a being in its own right. But it's not, as the whirlpool is really just the river, so you are just a feature, an aspect of nature, here conceived of as the mental cosmos or the mind at large. So my response to that point, first of all, I'd say, okay, so I think the problem here is used 2 quite different words. If you listen carefully to what he said, he uses 2 different words to say the same thing. He says that we're not separate from nature, but then he substitutes that word with distinct. Now, it seems to me an obvious point that something doesn't need to be separate to be distinct. My hand is not separate from my arm, but it is distinct. To use his own metaphor, the whirlpool is not separate from the river, but it is a distinct feature with its own behaviours. To kind of really push the point here, it doesn't really follow that nature can't have distinct features within it. However, to arrive at rational free will, my position for humans will have to offer some capacity within nature to allow for properties like rational freedom. And we might find indications that there are transcendent capabilities and capacities enfolded within nature. Bernardo's second point, he kind of says that since you are an aspect of this nature, a whirlpool, part of the river, you do nothing independently. You're just a part of nature's action, the action of the mental cosmos. So you can't have free will. Well, my response is, just as if you've watched Dr. Nathan Hawkins' recent video over on his channel, Absolute Philosophy, he points out that Bernardo already does assume the whirlpool does something different and distinct from the river. Bernardo sees nature, the conscious cosmos or mind at large, as lacking what he calls meta-consciousness. So what does that mean? He means that the cosmos is only phenomenally aware. It has just pure awareness. It's awake, so to speak, but it lacks what Bernardo calls meta-consciousness, or the quality of being aware that it's aware. So Bernardo already accepts that you, with your ability to be aware of your awareness, have distinct qualities from mind at large. The distinct whirlpool, while indeed part of the river, can do more than the river. If, as Bernardo claims, we can do nothing but what nature does, well, then we might have to question whether the cosmos is actually only phenomenally aware. On this point, I think his idealism would be strengthened by adhering to his own principles more closely. It seems right that nothing qualitatively greater can emerge from something qualitatively lesser. that there undeniably exists meta-consciousness. Rational deliberators like you and I needs explaining. Bernardo himself rejects what he calls strong emergence in his work. The idea that you really, that a thing can be gifted with properties not already existing in potential in its causes. So we have to ask, so where does this capacity for metaconsciousness, where does this capacity for rationality come from if we reject strong emergence? If the cosmos doesn't have these things in potentia, in potential, then where is it coming from? Bernardo's third point, I think, within what he was saying there, was this, that if we posit the reality of free will, we imagine that we're able to act apart from what he calls necessity. So necessity is a philosophical term, which means, we can't do otherwise. It's determined, it's law-like action. And since we are identical to the cosmos, which is entirely determined from his point of view and law-like, acts out of necessity, you also must be determined and law-like. And my response to that is, well, if there only exists a law-like cosmos, then I think this would be correct. But of course, I think he's begging the question. He's, effectively just assuming that instances of free will do not, in fact, exist. But if they do, then it follows that we don't live in a merely determined cosmos. So could it be then that when you look into the future and decide to act as a rational intellect, a rational agent, deliberating and choosing to do things, you might actually be a being endowed with the capacity to choose in a transcendent reality which empowers such things to emerge in nature? I think it might be so. Thanks for listening. Please don't forget to subscribe and to do a like, and please leave a comment, because I'd love to hear what you think. I'm sure there's going to be plenty of disagreement on this topic. It's a complex topic in many ways, but I'd welcome the discussion. Please feel free to agree, disagree, or ignore me, whatever you want. It's your choice.